Thank you all for being here on this Tuesday afternoon. My name is Kate Coyer with the Center for Media and Communication Studies here at CEU, and we're very, very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Wolfgang Kleinwaechter from the University of Aarhus, who has a very distinguished career in this field for many different aspects. I'm going to let him do a more proper introduction so that he can tell you more about some of the work that he's been doing with ICANN in this whole field of internet governance, has both a very current and contemporary perspective and very active work in the field, as well as some interesting historical perspective that hopefully will either come out in the talk or can come out in some of the discussion. And I believe we'll be speaking for about 45 to 60 minutes, and then we'll have time for about a half hour of discussion following. And so I'll ask if you could begin, and then also, again, by highlighting a few of the most interesting pieces, even if you wanted to say something about the purpose of your visit here to Budapest, for which we're very grateful and appreciative that you're able to come here for a little bit.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kate, for this nice introduction. And I'm really pleased and also moved to be here for the first time at the Central European University. I was in Budapest several times, also in the it was one of my first visits when I was a teenager. We met holidays at the Balaton in 1966. 1966, and you know how old I am. So, but anyhow, I came back in the 80s, then I worked here also in the early 90s when I was in a project where we tried to analyze on an international level the emerging broadcasting legislation in these former socialist countries. And then already in the middle of the 90s, I was pulled into the debates about the internet. The internet was there, as we will see in the lecture, already in the 1970s and 80s, but rather unknown. But in the 90s, it really became also a political issue, and it was, for me as an academic, a good moment to look deeper into the political, legal implications of the internet development. And this was before ICANN was established. ICANN was established in 1998, and so I was there from the very early days. So I participated in 36 of the 38 ICANN meetings and had also several functions. I also was pulled then into the process of the World Summit on the Information Society, which started then a couple of years later on as a reaction to what was going on in the United States and with ICANN. And the World Summit on the Information Society produced several other initiatives, including the Working Group on Internet Governance, the so-called WCIG, which was established because China and the United States could not agree how to manage the internet, and always if you cannot agree, then you create a working group. And Kofi Annan was invited as a Secretary General of the United Nations to establish a working group, and I had the honor to serve in the working group for 2 years. And then the compromise was then, which came out from the working group, to create another platform for discussion, which is called now the Internet Governance Forum. So that means, more or less, I was also then one of the founding fathers of this IGF, which is now in its 5th year. And just these days in New York, there is a discussion about the continuation of the IGF, and I will come to all these details later in my lecture in the last slides. But before I go to the present challenges and the challenges of the future, let me go a little bit back to the history, because my impression is, also my experience as an academic, is if you have no clue about the history, then you will not understand the future. So that means a lot of problems we are struggling today in our today lives are the result of a historical development. And if we do not understand where all this comes from, then probably we will have the wrong answers to the questions which are on the table today and tomorrow. So, and insofar, the first part of my lecture will go a little bit to the history. It's always interesting to ask people, do you know the birthday of the internet? Because every phenomenon has, let's say, a date where it started. So, and then people say, oh, it was in 1991 when Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. And as I say, no, it was in the 1980s when John Postel invented the domain name system. And as I say, no, it was in 19 1974, when Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn invented the TCP/IP protocol. And then people said, oh, the first connection was in 1969, when the 4 computers from the ARPANET were linked together. And then I say, yes, that's true, but why they had this in 1969? And then it goes back to a very concrete date, and a lot of people will not remember this, in particular your generation. This was October 4th in 1957. Does somebody remember what happened October 4th, 1957? Everybody remembers what happened on September 11th in 2001. Probably yes, when the 2 planes crashed into the Twin Towers in downtown Manhattan. So, but this was a similar shock for the United States. In October 4th, 1957, this was the date when the Soviet Union launched the first Sputnik. Why this was a shock for the US government? It was a rather simple thing, because the US had all the wars, had only one war on its own territory. This was the Civil War. And all the other wars in the 19th and 20th century took place outside of the territory of the United States of America. They had friendly neighbors in the north and the south, Mexico and Canada. And they had, you know, the ocean, Pacific Ocean and Atlantic Ocean on the 2 sides. That means a strong air force, a strong sea force was enough to protect the territory of the United States of America. So that means that was more or less, you know, a safe harbor. And with the Cold War and the risk of a 3rd World War, the shock came when the Russians demonstrated that they can attack the territory of the United States via the outer space. So the outer space suddenly became the window of vulnerability for the US military. And they said, okay, really, you know, the Russians can attack us. And the question was then what to do, how to react, like the US government started to think what we can do against terrorism in 2001. And there was a guy at Harvard University, Henry Kissinger, who later became the Foreign Secretary of the United States and the National Security Advisor, who wrote an interesting piece about diplomacy in the nuclear age or something like that. And one of the key questions was then raised, how we need a new strategy to react to this Soviet challenge. And the question was then, okay, what when the Russians attack us, what they will attack? Will they send a nuclear bomb to Los Angeles or New York City? Or what are the critical points for an attack? And, you know, it was rather simple. So one of the most decisive strategic element in the global policy is the communication network. That means if you have an army around the globe, you have to have communication capabilities. Communication and command and control, this C3, is rather the most important element of the military strategy. And probably some people have some experiences with revolutions. When a revolution takes place, what the revolutionaries do in the first place, they occupy the broadcasting station and the telecommunication center. That means to get control over communication is a key element. And insofar, you know, the Americans said, okay, if the Russians would attack our centralized military communication system, this would be bad for the military. So, and there was then a reaction that President Eisenhower in 1958, 1 year later, or half a year later, signed 2 laws which established 2 institutions. One was the NASA, which then, you know, and got the objective to win the race to the moon, because the Americans said we lost the race for the outer space, but then the race for the moon, we should be the winners. And the other was the ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency, which got the task to think out of the box and to develop alternative mechanisms how to protect the territory of the United States of America. While NASA was successful in 1969, the Americans really won the race to the moon. ARPA was also successful, because then ARPA sourced out a lot of research projects, and one was mainly to the Rand Corporation in the 1960s. And one idea was, okay, if we, you know, want to avoid that the Russians destroy our communication system, thank you very much, probably we can stimulate a research to build a decentralized communication system, not a centralized communication system. So the plan started in the 60s about research, where Harvard, the MIT in Massachusetts, and some other, mainly on the East Coast, institutions in the US were involved, thinking about what can we do to react to this Russian challenge. And so the idea was, if we have a decentralized communication system, then the Russians have no idea, or have, do not know where to place the bomb. And so the argument was, we need more nodes in a communication system than the Russians have rockets. So that means, so that if a communication center would be destroyed by an attack, then we can bypass it and can, send the messages and can continue communication via different channels. So I think this was the basic idea, which became then the internet, to have a decentralized networks where everybody can communicate with everybody. And I think this is really interesting to remember that on the beginning of the internet was the idea to create a mechanism which cannot be destroyed. This is insofar important for today, because some people say, oh, the internet will collapse or it will be attacked, and then, this is very critical. The internet can neither collapse nor controlled because of its decentralized nature. Because then, when it further was developed and became then via the TCP/IP protocol a global network, and I will go to this slide in the next slide, then it became more and more decentralized. So, and it's nearly impossible to destroy this. So just to go through the 4 waves of the further development, in the beginning it was indeed a military research project from 1957 to the early 70s. Then in the second wave, more or less the academics took it over, because it was mainly graduate students, then more and more on the West Coast in California, Stanford, Los Angeles, who were so excited by this option, to communicate to each other via computers. So that means the whole development in the 70s and 80s was driven to a high degree by academics, and mainly from the academic institutions on the West Coast. And here's also a very important, other interesting element, which explains a little bit the so-called subversive nature of the internet. The late 60s on the West Coast, this was the flower power time, San Francisco. If you go to San Francisco with flowers in your hair, older people will remember all these nice songs. So this was the hippie time, and this was also the time of the Vietnam War, when in particular American students were so angry with their own government that they protested everywhere, and this famous Beatles songs, Give Peace a Chance, at Kent State University, when American military, occupied also the campus, so has created a protest culture. And the graduate students, in particular the West Coast, were involved in this alternative culture, and they were so excited by this decentralized network that they say this undermines all hierarchies. This undermines central control. So it was always against Washington. So that means to be in California, it was good to be against Washington. This is centralized power. And it's really very funny if you read a book which was published in the 1980s, I think, called Abracadabra, which remembers the story from the ARPA network, that a guy who was involved that said, okay, we took the money from the Pentagon, but with the money, we tried to create a network which would undermine centralized power and which would not enable, this hierarchies and to feed the establishment, but to enable the individual people to do things what they want to do. And insofar, the basic architectural principle of the internet, the so-called end-to-end principle, where all the activities and the intelligence is on the end of the network, not in the center, is a result of this conceptual thinking which started in the 1960s and is part of this cultural environment, which was around the birthdays of the internet. Insofar, the academic wave of the internet played really an important role, and you have to understand this because a lot of principles and architectural principles and usage principles and all this are based in this culture. Then, after the invention of the World Wide Web, the third wave started, which we can call the commercialization of the internet. Before that, you know, I was in American University in Washington for 2 years in the early 90s, and I had an EDU address. And if people at this time, it was in 92, 93, had a .com address, these were the bad people. So that means to be a good people in the internet, you needed an EDU address, and .com was the commercial people, so that they did not respect the netiquette and all this. So, but this changed then dramatically, because then even students, after they finished their study, started to start a business, and so they realized, oh, this is a huge business opportunity, in particular with the World Wide Web, because vorher we worked with Gopher and, you know, other software which were rather not so friendly for commercial purposes. But the World Wide Web really opened the door, and then we saw the .com boom, and then it collapsed in the year 2000 and 2001. And what we see instead is that the internet is really now a medium for everybody. It's now we have 2 billion users. That means 1/3 of the world population has access to the internet. In 2015, we will see probably 4 billion users, and in the year 2020 or 2025, nearly everybody is connected to the internet. So, and this is really certain differences: the military past, the academic, push, then the commercial use, and now the internet for everybody. Why it doesn't go down? Okay, so I spoke about the military wave already, and let's spend some words about the second wave and the academic influence in making the internet. If you look into the internet is an arrangement of a lot of different elements linked together via so-called protocols. So the basic protocol is certainly the TCP/IP protocol. The idea was originally that if you have one computer, one network, that each computer in the network can communicate to the other computer. Originally, it was just the 4 in Stanford, in Los Angeles, in Santa Barbara, and in Utah. And but this was one network. And then in the 70s already, a couple of years later, there were 3 networks. One was the ARPA network, one was the so-called ALOA-net, which linked Hawaii to the west coast, and the other was the SATNet, which linked Europe to the east coast. So, and then Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn came and said, okay, why not to link the networks together, not just the computers in that network. So, and the TCP/IP protocol enabled the communication among networks. So that means one computer in Honolulu could communicate with one computer in Paris by going, through the various networks. So that's why also your IP address has always 2 blocks. One is the number for your computer, and the other one is the number for the network. And the internet is nothing else than a network of networks. Today you have around 50,000 networks which are connected via the protocol. That's why it's also so difficult to control it, because each network has more or less its own rules, but follows the same protocols. So it means everybody can communicate with everybody. This is really unique. Never before in the history of mankind we had such a communication tool that a guy sitting in Canberra, Australia, here can communicate with another guy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, send videos and audio forward and backward, and in real time. So this is really fantastic, and is enabled through all the servers, which are linked together and bring all the intelligence to the end user. So that means all the power, the wishes, and the initiatives are at the end users, and all between the networks and the servers and the computers which are linked together, just take a query, with an email address and send it, to the address on the website or the IP address. And I come a little bit later to then ICANN, because the understanding of the role of addresses and domain names is so important, because this really enables people then to communicate. So that means you cannot communicate without an address, an IP address, and without a domain name or an email address. So this is what you need. So you do not think about domain names and IP addresses, because you just want to go to a website. But if you would have no domain name, if you would have no IP address, no communication would be there. And all this was developed step by step by individuals. So that means the internet was driven never by a governmental order or by an industry-pushed research project. It was driven bottom-up by people who had an idea, was sitting in a classroom or in a coffee house or elsewhere, or in a beer bar, and saying, you know, can we do this? Can we do this? So Roy Tomlinson used then the ad, you know, for the addressing email addresses. The domain name system was invented by two guys, Paul Macapetris and John Postel, and also the institutions which were built, like the so-called law book of the internet, the RFCs, the request for comments, or the Internet Architecture Board, or then later the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the Internet Society. All these were institutions which were built bottom-up in a way by people who were engaged. So, and they did not ask the government whether this is allowed or not allowed. So the nice slogan which we have today, innovation without permission, stands for the internet development. Nobody asked it, the government, whether this is allowed or not allowed. So there was no regulation for this, because it was in the shadow of governmental regulation that all this emerged. Even the US government, you know, did not regulate it in a way, even, you know, if they paid for it, because it was governmental money which was spent to develop this in the 1980s. But the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States, you know, preferred an approach on deregulation. So, and there was no idea to have a regulation. And this is a huge difference to previous communication technologies. So when the telecommunication was invented, the first thing what governments did, they created a national telecommunication law and regulated very strongly what is allowed, what is not allowed. If broadcasting was established, the first thing you saw was a national broadcasting legislation, which also regulated technical specifications. That means use of frequency spectrum or use of devices. All this was very regulated. If you used an individual frequency, or, you know, created another device without permission, so this was declared as illegal, and you risked to become jailed. So, but with the internet, there was no national internet legislation. It was just sent to the edges, and if somebody had an idea, thanks to the protocols, it was so simple to connect. Larry Page did not ask whether it's allowed to establish Google, so he just did it. Mark Zuckerberg did not ask whether it's allowed to start Facebook, he just did it. So, and I think this is a little bit the philosophy which is behind this years of the academic wave in the 1970s and 80s, and also when you need a basic understanding of the domain name system, and this was done by these two guys, Paul Macapetris and John Postel. I explained already a little bit that the numbers have two blocks, you know, the IP address numbers. One is the network, the other one is the computer. We have one protocol, which is the IP version 4 protocol, which has around 4.3 billion numbers, and at this time in the 1980s said, okay, this is enough numbers for the rest of the life. But then they realized in the 90s with the dot-com boom that probably we need more addresses, and then they created another protocol, IP version 6 protocol, where you have zillions of addresses. The problem now is that we use mainly IP version 4 addresses, and indeed we are running out now of IP version 4 addresses. Just some millions of addresses are left, and we have to transfer to this new protocol, IP version 6. Probably if somebody is involved in this, we can discuss this in the break. I will not go deeper now into this issue. Just want to flag it that this, among the technical issues of today, there is a problem with IP addresses. With domain names, here also, you know, we have an interesting development at the moment, but where it comes from from the idea of these two persons who said, okay, let's create numbers. People cannot remember numbers. We have already phone numbers and fax numbers and mobile phone numbers and PIN codes, and so if you would have to remember this long IP address number, so this was seen as unhuman. And so Postel and Macapetris worked on a system to translate the numbers into names. So because name gives the number a human face. And so more or less they modeled the domain name system according to the names in the real world. So with a family name and a given name or two given names, like John Fitzgerald Kennedy or Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev. So that means the important name is the family name. So, and so they created, they called it top-level domain. And they originally, Postel said it's enough if we have 3 top-level domains for the US, .gov, .mil, and .edu, for the educational institutions, for the military, and for the governmental people, and then 3 for the world, .com, .net, and .org, .com for commercial people, .net for networks, and .org for organizations, and that's enough. And then somebody knocked at the door from John Postel and said, hi, there are hundreds of countries, or more than 150 countries in the world. Would it be good to give every country also a domain name, a top-level domain? And he said, yes, this could be a good idea, why not? And then he said, okay, give me the list of the countries. And he went to the United Nations. The United Nations at this time had around 148 member states. Switzerland was not on the list because Switzerland was in a neutral position in the 80s and did not join the United Nations. They hosted the United Nations in Geneva, but were not a member of the United Nations. So he said, okay, you know, I'm not in a position as John Postel to decide what a country is and whom I should give a top-level domain. And so finally, he found a list managed by the International Standardization Organization, ISO, which managed also codes for car plates and for all kinds of things. And so, and on the list there was 243 countries and so-called territories. And he said, that's the largest list I could find, and he added 2 character codes to all these 243 countries and territories. This has created a funny situation that, for instance, in the United Kingdom, that some of the islands, like the Isle of Man and Guernsey, and so they were on the list, and they have an own top-level domain, while United Kingdom was there just as a country. And Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland and England were not on the list. So that means now in the UK you have a curious situation that you have a top-level domain .im for the Isle of Man. But the Scots want to have also a top-level domain, but they were not on the list and they didn't get it. And the delegation was also very simple. Postel just, you know, delegated it by handshake. So he had a friend and said, okay, if I trust you, then you can manage this, this top-level domain. So that means in Germany in 1985, when .de was delegated, there was just 13 domain names registered. It was not a big thing. No parliament, no political party, no government took note of this. So you know how battles you have about telephone numbers. You know, if you change your provider, can you take the telephone number from one provider to another one? All this is very specifically regulated. But here in this field, it was just the handshake of an American guy to a friend who said, I trust you. And trust played an important role, because this was a network of networks, but it was a network of people. So the people knew each other who made all this happen, and they trusted each other, and they also respected certain rules, the so-called netiquette. So this was a different time, and so, and this worked quite well. So that means the top-level domains were delegated by handshake, and today under .de you have 13 million registered domain names. It's quite an incredible development. So, but this was more or less the beginning of the domain name system, and then to complete this, there is a need that you all these are in a database, and you need a so-called, the domain name system is like a tree, you know, which ends up with the top-level domains, and you have to have these zone files of the top-level domains in one root. So that means that each domain name can communicate with another domain name. So that means if you go from an address like my address, au.dk, Aarhus University, Denmark, to your address, ceu.hu in Hungary. So then, you know, my university goes to the name server from the DK registry, and because the DK registry has no knowledge about the HU registry, they ask the root server, and the root server has all the zone files from all the 280 now top-level domains, And then the root server can send the query to the HU registry, and the HU registry sends the query to your computer at the Central European University, and then you can communicate. So normally you do not think about this, how this works from server to server, because it's done in a second. But this is the way how it's organized. Insofar, the root server is an important element, and this has produced in later political conflicts about the control of the root server. Who controls the root server? Who has, who allows that something is put into the root server, and who can make decisions to take something out of the root server. And who allocates these domain names now, who allocates these IP addresses. All these were rather complicated questions then, which produced a debate about the management of all this. Before I come to this management, let me just give you some interesting quotations from key figures in this internet if it comes to certain concepts. I think Tim Berners-Lee had this very interesting idea in 1991 where he said there is an idea that society can run without a hierarchical bureaucratic government being involved in every step, if only we can hit on the right set of rules for peer-peer interaction. Our design of the internet and the web is a search for a set of rules which will allow computers to work together in harmony. And our spiritual and social quest is for a set of rules which allow people to work together in harmony. So that's a little bit the idealism that say, okay, probably we can organize the living together based on the principles, how we architecture the internet. Dave Clark from the IETF made it very clear, and this is still today the slogan of the IETF: we do not believe in kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus, factual approach, and running code. So that means forget about these governments of today, so we are moving into the world of tomorrow. And this became even more clear in a nice statement of Peter Barlow. He was also a rock singer. And he presented in the Davos World Economic Forum a declaration of cyber independence, where he said, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, a new home of mine. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. So I bring this quotation that you understand, the cultural climate, which was around the internet in this, today you could say early days of the 90s. Then later, a lot of this idealism and so, went away. So, but I think Laura Lessing, who is still one of the most brilliant writers about internet issues, made it already clear in 1998 that, the internet is not so neutral, so that it's regulated not by laws, but primarily by code. That code is the law of the internet. That means the way how we, let's say, design the technology allows us to do things or stop us to do things. So that means, and his argument that you have to understand how code regulates if you want to understand cyberspace is still there. And he made very clear that, the code is made by man. He said, we can build or architect and code cyberspace to protect values that we believe are fundamental, or we can allow those values to disappear. So there is no middle ground. Code is never found. It's only ever made and only ever made by us. So that means the making of the future is in the hand, let's say, of the code makers. And you see an interesting battle between the lawmakers of the one hand and the code makers of the other hand. And then in the past, it was the lawmakers, like in broadcasting and telecommunication, which created the space for the code makers. Today, it's the code makers, which open spaces, and then the lawmakers trying, to regulate it nationally or internationally and to fix it with a certain regulation. I think this is a fundamental shift and a new perspective. But this opens the question, who controls the code makers? So who are these guys who are creating the future, who are building the spaces where our life will be in the future? So is it really Mark Zuckerberg who wakes up in the morning and says, okay, for 500 million people, I decide what privacy is, yes or no? So I think this is an interesting question and leads to the challenges of tomorrow. And this is also then in my second and last part of the lecture. So I have still 15 minutes to go. A final quotation from Wayne Cerf, and I think this is also interesting to remember this, that he said, the question was, would it be something that could be rolled out to the rest of the world when he invented the TCP/IP protocol? And he said, we didn't know for sure, but when we worked on it, we decided not to patent, not to copyright, not to control, but to share everything we knew about the internet design to the general public all around the world. The keyword is here that he said, okay, we did not really introduce intellectual property into the code. We opened it to the public. I think this is really, from today's perspective, an incredible decision. So that means this is a present to all the world. Because if they would have copyrighted it, then you would have to pay just, you know, to get the next connection. This would be the telecommunication world then in the internet. So, and thanks to these people, so this did not happen. And he introduced this right to share. So we see that the right to share is seen by a lot of people as an element of the right to freedom of expression, so that you share your opinion with others, you share. The sharing, it's not only sharing music files or MP3 files, it's a lot of video files or something like that. So the concept of share is indeed really interesting, and it goes back to people like this. And he added here a very interesting additional observation when he said, what is amazing is that it was a US Department of Defense project, and we were in the middle of the Cold War. In spite of all that, we made all this completely available to everybody. And the only reason it was possible is nobody paid any attention to us. I think that, you know, the people, even in the Pentagon, did not understand what we were doing. So that means if they would have understood, this would have a very delicate affair in the Cold War period. So, but I think this is also interesting to remember. Okay. I mentioned already when I talked about the domain name system, IP addresses, that these are critical resources, and you cannot, you know, use the internet without these resources. Insofar, it was understandable that in the 90s, a battle started, who controls these resources, who manages these resources, domain names, IP addresses, root servers. So there were various efforts, I will not go into details, and they ended up in, in a project supported by the United States government, who said, okay, we should not hand over this domain names and IP address management to the governments, because there was a plan that the ITU wanted to get it in 1997. So the plan was, okay, should the United Nations and the ITU as a United Nations specialized agency manage these critical resources for the internet, domain names, IP addresses, and root servers? And the alternative was, under the Clinton administration in the US, no, this is a better idea. It should be done by the people who do it, who understand it, the concerned and the affected people themselves. That means the private sector, the registries, the registrars, the ISPs, and all these people who more or less are labeled as the internet community. So, and this has led to the establishment of ICANN. ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's a private corporation under Californian law, and it was linked until recently with a contract to the United States government, which has then provoked other governments to say this is a better idea, the internet is controlled by the Americans, which is partly true, but which is also very good, because the Americans had an understanding, and their role was to protect the freedom of the internet to a high degree. Let's wait and see what will happen in the future if it comes to network neutrality and other issues. But anyhow, you know, this is important to understand that the role of ICANN was not an effort by the United States government to control the world, or, you know, to control the internet, but the alternative was that it goes to the United Nations, and then you would have a battle like always in the United Nations, if you would have something like an Internet Security Council, so with China and Russia and France and Pakistan and India on the same table with the same votes, then you could imagine what will happen and how much progress you could reach in further development of the internet, so if it becomes politicized in this way. And insofar, looking backwards, it was a rather wise decision by the Clinton administration to try to keep this out from this intergovernmental political battle, and to give ICANN, the governments a special rather unique and interesting role in the ICANN structure. So ICANN is a private corporation, as I said. It has a mandate for root servers, domain names, and IP addresses. It's managed by a board of directors, which are coming from the various constituencies of ICANN, the private sector, the users, and other groups. And the governments have only an advisory capacity. The governments are in the ICANN architecture only sitting in a so-called governmental advisory committee. So they can give advice to a private corporation. And this is for a lot of governments not so comfortable situation. Normally, governments give order to somebody, not advice in particular, because the advice of the Governmental Advisory Committee is not binding for the ICANN board. That means if the ICANN board thinks this is a bad advice, they can ignore it and can reject it without any consequences. So, and here you see already a battle which was not so prominent in 1998 when it was established, because only a small number of governments were involved. But then later, in particular, when China and Russia entered the field, so they felt in a very uncomfortable situation as a government to sit in a committee which can give only advice to a private corporation sitting in the United States of America dealing with the critical internet resources, IP addresses, domain names, and root servers. So this is I think, one of the remarkable innovations which came with the ICANN development, so that the decision-making power is in the hand of the users and providers of the services and not in the hand of government. So that means the people themselves more or less control this via their constituencies, supporting organizations and other committees which has been created within ICANN. And the policy development within ICANN is a bottom-up development process where you start like on a round table to discuss issue, to identify issue, and then to say, okay, do we need a policy here? So it's totally different from a parliamentarian procedure where parties are fighting, you know, for a majority in the parliament. So here you have the same principle like you have in the IETF, running code and rough consensus. You discuss an issue as long, you know, as you need input from all sides. And if you have reached a certain level where the majority of the constituencies are more or less can agree with this, then you declare this is rough consensus. So it's not voting. This is really trying, you know, to get all big arguments on board, regardless from which corner you come. So that means, so that's why also the internet is so far stable, because, you know, you more or less this way avoid that you have, let's see, you know, dividing parties then. We know this from standardization processes in the ITU. In the old times it was, for instance, different standards for TV, color television. The French had their standards, the American had their standards, the German had their standards. You could not communicate. The same happened then in the telephony sector or with videos. When you bought a video cassette in the United States, it didn't play in Europe, or if you were a couple of years ago with your mobile phone in the United States, you could not make phone calls to Europe because there were different standards. And this is happening if the standardization process is done by an intergovernmental organization, where then governments fight for their national interests. And this is here totally different, because this is the beauty of the internet. If somebody invents YouTube or MySpace or else, then immediately, you know, millions, 500 million of people are now under Facebook. And they do not ask whether they are from Australia or from Argentina, from Greenland, or from the city of Budapest. So they just communicate with each other, because this is based on the rough consensus, which where the IETF builds the structures. And ICANN follows more or less this principle, and the policy development there is bottom-up in a transparent, open way. All constituencies can be involved. The only entrance fee you have to pay is knowledge. You have to be knowledgeable. So that means if you have nothing to say, then you should go home. So, but if you can make a contribution, if you can make knowledge, then you are welcome. And because people are needed. And this is a totally different policy style, as we know from from other circles. So now come to the more political controversies. It was clear that you know, this silent revolution, which started, you know, with ICANN, a bottom-up revolution, more or less undermining continuation with the subversive nature of the internet from the 1960s and 70s. You know, if big governments then became involved, they had a different approach. In particular, China was, when the World Summit on the Information Society started in 2002, the Chinese government was really trying to use this World Summit to change the system. The argument was, okay, private sector leadership is good for 1 million users, but for 1 billion users, we need now governmental control. So, and the controversy about the World Summit was really who oversees these critical internet resources. And the Chinese wanted to have that the United Nations and governments will control it. And the US said, no way, it should be done by ICANN. So it was China versus US, governmental leadership versus private sector leadership, ITU versus ICANN. And the question was then, okay, we are talking about internet governance, what it is. So that means there was, people used the same terminology, governance of the internet, and had different things in mind. Some people talking about cybersecurity, e-commerce, and all kinds of applications, freedom of expression in the internet. Others talked about just the technical resources, domain names, IP addresses. The problem is that everything is interlinked. That means if China wants to get the bad guys which use freedom of expression, then they need an IP address to find the guy. And then they need the ISPs who have the knowledge of the IP address. And insofar, you cannot separate this. And so, as I said already, the working group on internet governance more or less was challenged with all these issues, and we came out with a rather broad definition. We said internet governance is more than names and numbers. It's the development application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. There are some key words here in this definition. One is governments, private sector, and civil society in their respective roles. That means the conflict between governmental leadership and private sector leadership was more or less solved in a way that, say, each stakeholder has to play a certain role. Civil society has to play a role, the governments have to play a role, private sector has to play a role. There should be no leadership. It should be multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I think this was the answer to this conflict, private sector versus government. That means all affected and concerned stakeholders has to be involved in managing the internet. There should be no single organization taking care of everything. It's a distributed system, a multi-layer, multi-player mechanism where various groups have various responsibilities on various issues. Probably for domain names, it's better if ICANN does it. For cybersecurity, it's good if the ITU, or for infrastructure, if the ITU takes the lead. If we talk about e-commerce, probably the OECD is the right organization. Multilingualism on the internet, probably the UNESCO is the better organization. So it depends from the issue, and not to create, a new cyber space convention or a central organization which controls the whole internet. A decentralized system. This was the reaction to this conflict between governments and private sector. And the other important thing is of shared principles, norms, rules, and decision-making. Sharing, as I said already earlier in the quotation from Vint Cerf, is really the philosophy here. This, if it comes to policy, this is really an incredible conflict, because we speak about shared norms, principles, shared responsibility, and this means also shared sovereignty. That means today in the world of the global world, you cannot continue with the traditional understanding of national sovereignty. You have to share, with others if you want to survive in this global environment. So, but this goes very in contrast to traditional understanding that national sovereignty has a decision maker on the top, and if you have the power, then you can, if you have the votes also in the parliament, then you can push for it. So ignoring, the environment, if you have just the power structure behind you. So I think this principle of sharing responsibility, shared principles, norms, rules, pushes you into a collaborative environment. Where you have, before you act, you have to communicate with others. You need a higher level of communication, a higher level of coordination, a higher level of collaboration. So the whole system gets much more complex than our traditional national system. So, but that's the only alternative how you can manage such a global mechanism as the internet it is. So, and certainly that's why, the outcome of the World Summit was we should not create an internet government So a body, you know, which takes care of it, we need more discussion, we need more consultations. And so the proposal was then not to create a United Nations Internet organization, but to create a United Nations Internet Governance Forum, which is open for all stakeholders, where private sector, civil society people, ministers, CEOs, people from human rights organizations, can talk to each other about the problems of the future and not just to make decisions which then finally will not work. So I think the Tunis summit then finally adopted this proposal for the Internet Governance Forum, and since that, you know, we have a continuing debate about the who controls the domain names and the IP addresses. For the moment, there was more or less, there was a compromise that let's wait and see what the Internet Governance Forum will produce. So China, Russia, the main two opponents, said, okay, let's wait and see how this will be worked out. So, and the Internet Governance Forum started in the year 2006. And so in the last 5 years, we saw a number of changes or latest developments. One was that the United States government, when Obama became president, finally decided to give ICANN the independence which was promised by the Clinton administration. So I think this was really a critical point for a lot of people in the world, that they said, okay, ICANN is just an arm of the US government, which was never true, but it looked like. So, and then that they ended this joint project agreement and have signed now a so-called affirmation of commitment in the last year between the US government and ICANN, really has given ICANN a much more independent status. The open question remains, and we can discuss this in a couple of minutes in the discussion space, is, you know, to whom ICANN is accountable. So they are totally independent. Can they do whatever they want? It's a different question. So, but it's an interesting development that the US government, at least, you know, gave ICANN the independence. They have still a certain control over the root server, but this is a different story. The Internet Governance Forum has evolved surprisingly well. So some people in the beginning said this is nothing else as a new talking shop. But after 5 IGFs, the result is that I think all stakeholders, with the exception of the Chinese government, is rather satisfied and said, okay, that's true. We have first to talk before we have to act. We have first to think and to communicate with others, to understand what the issue is. Otherwise, we will make wrong decisions. China wants to change the Internet Governance Forum into an intergovernmental process. That means to exclude, again, the private sector and the civil society from the debate. But the majority of the members in the Internet Governance Forum say, okay, wait a minute, the richness of the discussion and the experiences is very often with the civil society, with the private sector. They have the knowledge, with the technical community, they know how it works. So, and the only way we can move forward is really if we have this collaborative approach and not just to do it as a government alone. I think a good example is this you know, failed law in Germany where, you know, on the eve of elections, you know, people in some parties said, okay, we have to do something against child pornography on the internet. I think everybody agrees that child porn on the internet is a bad thing and it should be stopped, and we should look for the criminals to bring them to justice. But the way how the German government did it without any consultations with the private sector and the civil society was just to introduce a filtering system, which means, okay, they said, okay, close your eyes. So that means the child porn would remain in the internet world, but they would just, you know, not allow the German people to watch this. So, and everybody knows it's so simple to bypass this. The tunnel is, and, you know, to use a server from elsewhere. So, and then after the elections, when the debate, you know, boiled, then the result was that now the new parliament, the new government, you know, even it was adopted by the former government, does not like the law anymore. And so we have a curious situation in Germany that we have an existing law which is not used by anybody. Nobody wants to touch it. The president has signed it, so it's in the textbooks, but because it's totally stupid. And this is the result if you have a one-stakeholder approach, if governments alone act. And I think this will probably happen in a lot of other countries where governments ignore, let's say, the multi-stakeholder principle, do not consult with the technical community, with private sector and civil society, and this is a great risk. And so far, the Internet Governance Forum has showed a way how this can be discussed, and meanwhile we see also Internet governance fora emerging on a regional level, on a national level, and so this multi-stakeholder approach is probably an interesting policy alternative, where you bring really the people who are affected, who are involved, who are concerned, to the decision-making process, and not only, you know, as protesters in the street or as lobbyists in the lobby of the parliament. The battle is not over in the ITU. Just the last couple of days, there are tremendous efforts, you know, to get that some governments in the ITU want to get again control over the internet resources. The ITU Plenipotentiary Conference in Guadalajara just ended last weekend, and there was serious efforts by the Russian government in particular to change the role of the Governmental Advisory Committee and to give the functions of the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN into the hand of the ITU, and then the ITU would be the oversight body for ICANN. So this was stopped for the moment, but this will certainly continue. You see now that in a lot of other institutions, internet policy, governance became a subject. The OECD had a ministerial conference in South Korea 2 years ago in July on the internet economy. The European Commission has adopted recently its Digital Agenda 2020. The Council of Europe has established an expert group on the new legal instrument, and the United Nations deals always this. So I will bring this now to an end, and just looking ahead in the year 2015. If we look into the future, you know, what will be probably in the year 2015? My expectation is we will have 4 billion internet users. We will have a multilingual internet so that people can speak in their local languages. We will have all kinds of converged services. People say it's Web 3.0 or 4.0, I don't know. We will have new models of governance. This multi-stakeholder model will spread to all kinds of arenas, and I cannot imagine that the internet can be governed in a different way than only the multi-stakeholder way. We will see the Internet of Things, that billions, trillions of objects will be via an RFID chip and IP version 6 address will be linked to the internet. Cloud computing, social networks. Probably we will see, obviously, also identification systems which go beyond the domain name system. Nobody knows. So what will be the big challenges? The network, will it be one internet as we know it today, or will it be fragmented? So what we see now in the network neutrality debate is that the Verizon and Google proposal is to say probably for the mobile internet we have different rules than for the fixed. This would be a fragmentation. China said, okay, if we have the internationalized network, probably we create a network only for Chinese characters, so where we speak in China, and then if the people want to leave the Chinese network and go to the international networks, they need a password. The password is handed out on an annual basis and based on your behavior. If you're a good guy, then you get the password for the next year or things like that. All these are the risks. Will the policy continue to be developed bottom up, or will it come down via the governments? Will the management be multi-stakeholder self-organization or governmental and commercial control? I think the big challenge is now is that on the one side, big industry is interested to get control over parts of the internet. So they want to charge you, they want to bring, the argument is bring intelligence to the network, not from the edges to the center of the network, so that we know what the people are doing and then we can profile them with their consumer behavior and we can charge them for various special services and not just to give it for free. And on the other hand, the government is also interested to bring, let's say, intelligence back to the center of the network so that we can know what our citizens are doing, whether they are good citizens or bad citizens, criminals or terrorists or the bad guys. So, and here you see a risk now, and this explains the title of the nice book from Jonathan Zittrain, who has titled his book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. Because the future of the Internet could be that big government and big industry goes together. Industry, for, profit reasons, and the governments, for control reasons. And then the small user would be the big loser. It's not multi-stakeholderism. You have just this bilateral combination of industry and government. But this is exactly the challenge of the future of the next years. And insofar, to further develop this multi-stakeholder model, where the civil society, the internet user in ICANN, it's the at-large community, have a seat on the table, is a very crucial element. So, and while we take it more or less for granted, that the internet, as it has evolved in the 70s and 80s, with a lot of idealistic slogans, will continue forever. This is not a given. This can be different, so we can move in a different way. The battle is not lost, so there is reason for hope. Because as you have experienced not only in China but in other cases, as soon as the control hand comes, you can bypass this and can tunnel this, and you have anonymous software like Tor and all things. There are a lot of nice things. But whatever happens, one thing is for sure, and this is the final sentence now, internet governance will remain the subject of high-level political controversies, and it will be about power and money. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a little bit longer than expected. Sorry for this. Yeah.
At the risk of overstepping, maybe if I could jump in to start and then we'll open it up. I have a very small question and then I have a bigger question. The small question is going back to something you were talking about when the decision was being made off of this list of international standards of setting up the country domain names. One thing that strikes me is that in Germany it's .du, which obviously comes from the German word for Germany, but in Hungary it's .hu. And there was a question within Hungary not so long ago, how recent was it? Okay. Around whether or not that should be changed. And it is interesting to see, so if it was this list or what countries were kind of, do you have any inside story to that? And then my second question, which is the bigger question, and I say this as somebody that comes from a civil society, so to speak, an activist and advocate background, and I want to ask the question, the more cynical question, to say, do you see through these processes that civil society is really having an impact? I mean, we know that, of course, governments and corporations, there's an unequal distribution of power, even at the level of these kinds of working groups and meetings where there is a very, significant attention to trying to maintain some level of multi-stakeholderism, if you will. But in terms of when we see the stories, when we hear about the Google and Verizon deal and the impact on net neutrality, there's no civil society piece to that story. And we know there's lots of groups that are working hard behind the scenes, especially around issues of privacy protection and certainly, child protection. There's lots of groups that are working towards this. But do you see that there's a real distinction being how much of an impact are non-governmental and non-corporate groups having? And maybe the question is, as you answer, maybe the question lies, or the answer lies in how you set up the challenges, and it's maybe undetermined. So small question and a bigger question.
The small question first, and it was just the ISO code. That means the International Standardization Organization, as I said already, had all kinds of codes for countries. Car plates and airports and all this, so that they have airports is a 3-character code, 3-letter code, and for the car plates it's also they had different codes. And I think for the car plate in Hungary it's also just H. Yeah. So but for Hungary on the ISO list was HU. And so there was no explaining, there was no consultation, as I said, with national parliaments or governments or parties or the community. He just went to the list and said, there's an IFC 1975, which says, the internet community or I myself, I'm not responsible for what a country is. So, and he said, okay, I take the list. People in ISO will have a procedure. They determine what it is. And so, you had for some countries, very nice codes, like the island of Tuvalu, got the 2-letter code .tv. They had only 5 computers when VeriSign bought this and gave him 5 million or 50 million. So they financed the first university in Tuvalu with money which came from the domain name, which is now sold with high prices for, I think a lot of companies have meanwhile a .tv domain, IBM TV and BMW TV and also the traditional television stations. Laos has the country code .la. A businesswoman from Hong Kong got the right to manage to sell this in the Los Angeles arena for celebrities. You know, Sharon Stone.la or something like that. So there are funny things. There's a management, you know, or efforts to get Turkmenistan to give the .tm, which is trademark, you know, free for registrations. So there are a lot of these things. So, but this is the result. So Postel is not responsible for that. He took what was on the list. The second question is, you know, if you put this in the historical context of the 21st century, so, you know, 90 years to go. So I think, yes, it makes a difference. If you compare how diplomacy was made in the 20th century, where these groups are totally excluded. It was only, you know, diplomacy and governmental dealing behind closed doors, and so that means the people were really not asked so to participate. And if you see this now in the last 10, 15 years, so then you see a growing curve, so that the influence of the so-called third sector at large in ICANN, civil society, the users, so that they play really a greater role than before. When the World Summit on the Information Society started, the original plan was to have other stakeholders invited, but with no speaking rights, with no sitting rights, so that means just to go to the plenary, and then people were moved out of the plenary room. And then they closed the doors, and then people were knocking at the door, opened the door, and they wanted to in. And so within the World Summit on the Information Society, which created a good example, they started, you know, with access right to the room, just to listen what they are doing, because if people are in the room and there are negotiations, this creates a certain pressure for the people who are acting. So then it's even better if you have speaking rights. And then from speaking rights, you move to discussion rights. That means that you can participate in the discussion. From discussion rights, you move to negotiation rights. And from negotiation rights to voting rights. So it's you know, you have to go step by step. And I think at the moment, historically, we are probably in between, let's say, speaking rights and discussion rights. So civil society is more or less excluded from a lot of really important decision making. But, you know, via speaking and participating in the discussions, they influence already decisions. So it's more about not policy making, but policy shaping. So, and in so far, all the efforts you described from the United States, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, ACLU, and lots of other these organizations, their statements, they are invited to hearings in the US Congress. And so that means if they express their views, then they are heard, even if they are not able to push for their position to the final end, but they influence the decision, and it remains a struggle. And it's just the first decade of the 21st century. So I think it will be on the agenda for the next 90 years.
Yeah, I've got two questions, kind of like devil's advocate questions.
Okay.
One is about, you explained how at the roots of the decentralized democratic character of the internet is this end-to-end structure, where the pipes, the infrastructure of the internet is nothing but dumb pipes. All the content and control is on the end users who create the content that's going to be sent through the internet and receive it. Nothing happens in between. And you illustrated the dangers that people now, governments and companies, want to get into that system and start controlling it so they can charge people and stuff. But they do make an argument that a lot of advanced internet applications can simply not run on an end-to-end structure, like a 3D video, high definition broadcast that needs continuous quality of service, a virus-free internet, stuff like that. So, is it still feasible for like net neutrality advocates to champion for retaining the pure end-to-end model, or should we incorporate, change an example of good practice, say like, well, we have to accommodate these new needs with another way, and what should it be? That's one, sorry. Two, you talked about IGF as an example of multi-stakeholderism, and I've read also a lot of like peers to the IGF as how multi-stakeholderism can work, and the advantages, as described also in your presentation, are basically that it has lent itself to a lot of sharing of expertise, and it's a value that the function of this system is a value in itself because it affirms the role of civil society. But in all these IGFs so far, what specific important decisions have come from this multi-stakeholder dialogue that has changed the function of the internet? Just a couple of examples.
Okay. The first question about network neutrality. I think this is a point which is used very often, in particular by telecom operators, that will say, okay, if 80–90% of the internet traffic gets video, and that means we have to broadband, it needs more investment, and so we have to find a way to refinance this, so we have to have this classification and prioritization and quality of service is then the argument. It's a real argument. You have to deal with this. On the other hand, you know, then you take for granted that the network will, or the capacity of the network will remain as it is today. I remember discussions 10 years ago when VoIP started, Voice over Internet IP. So the telco said, okay, this is such a bad quality that it's not a competitor. Quality of service was seen as a guarantee for their business. So, but 10 years later, you know, now VoIP and Skype offers, you know, a service which has really high quality. So because we have a different network. I see that certainly, you know, as a result of this, you know, explosion of video, internet communication, we see a next generation of broadband also in networks. So that means the argument we have to make sure that for certain services the high quality is served, because otherwise, you know, the network will collapse, I think is a tricky argument which goes just from the reality as it is today. So tomorrow the capacities will be much bigger. The other point is certainly the idea to split the internet into economy class, business class, and first class. So that's my critical argument against this, what I call the fragmentation, is that this leads unavoidable to discrimination. That means while you argue in favor of certain high-level services, and the argument which is used in the Verizon-Google deal is for medical services, that means if you make operation, that you have to have 100% quality of services, otherwise you risk lives and things like that. So these are the arguments put forward. But if you introduce this really on a general basis, then the flip side is that you introduce discrimination. And the question is, who guarantees on the let's say on the certain checkpoint, who makes this differentiation, that you say, okay, you are important, you are less important. I could live with some exceptions, as we know it, you know, from the traffic. If there is a blue light car, an emergency car, if you have an accident, then, you know, the free traffic for all cars, you know, is removed to the sidelines, and you have to give way for this. But this has to be very specifically defined, very exceptional cases, and cannot be used as a general rule. Otherwise, really, you know, you have the internet of the future will be business class, first class, and economy class. And economy class means you can forget about all the services as long as you do not pay. Then you get even not a sandwich anymore. So, and the second question, you know, with the Internet Governance Forum and the results, yeah, that's the problem. It's not a decision-making body. That means the IGF itself does not take decisions, but, you know, it inspires decision. It can be a clearinghouse. It can find out, you know, who is responsible for what, who would make a decision, and it can organize pressure in favor of decisions. I think that ICANN made a decision for the introduction of IDNs. That means for top-level domains in Cyrillic, in Chinese characters, in Korean characters, in Arabic characters just recently, in Persian characters for Iran. So is a result of the discussion in the IGF. I think ICANN needs, unfortunately, also years and years before a decision. But the fire ICANN realized in the IGF, that people came and said, you know, we want to communicate in our local language, and you have to speed it up, organized such a pressure on ICANN that they speed it up. It was the fast track for the IDNs and CCTLDs. So, and I think also, you know, if the IGF can play this role as a watchdog, as a pressure group, and to tell people, although, you know, my proposal was, you know, for the next IGF to invite Mark Zuckerberg so that he is confronted with the debate about, you know, internet governance within social networks. Is it just, you know, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the decision of one man, or should we, if 500 million people are forming this network, should they have a certain representation? So why not to have a Facebook parliament where, you know, the 500 million users elect representatives, and then they sit next to Mr. Zuckerberg and say, okay, this is our interest, and now let's define the rules. I think this is what happened in the middle of the 19th century when capitalism emerged, and then people felt, you know, hopeless, and then they created trade unions, and they started to negotiate with the owner of the factory and said, okay, here are certain conditions, and please respect also our interests. So, and I think this will be probably a way for the future, and the IGF can push this forward, can stimulate, can produce the ideas, and can also be function as an early warning system. If something goes wrong, then the IGF will be the first place where people, you know, ring the alarm bell.
Can I just add one anecdote to that? One of the, a very active and strong kind of union in a looser term is the Los Angeles Bus Riders Union. And it's not a formalized union of people working in a particular industry, okay, but a union of users of public transportation. And they've actually had some success in lobbying for, you know, a reduction in the fees when they were being put up to subsidize kind of, you know, more middle class and upper class travel. But anyway, so there are some interesting models of something like that. Anyone else wanted to jump in on any of this?
I have a question. Yeah. Related to civil service having more impact in decision making across the world and then in various bodies, do you think that there's a correlation between the spread of the internet and access to internet and that access? And my second question is, I'm curious as to what you think the impact of multilingual internet will have as it takes off.
Sometimes, you know, I see the internet as a pioneer for new development. So that means what happened in the internet today probably will be, if it continues to be successful, copied by other areas of life that they say, okay, they feel inspired. I think just to take one example from Germany, we have a huge debate which started as a local debate about the rebuilding of a railway station in the city of Stuttgart. And so normally, you know, this is a $1 billion project, and the decision was more or less made by the politicians and by the industry. And now if people realize what's going on in their city, so they became very angry and said, you know, you built something which we do not want to have. And so hundreds of thousands of people were standing in the street and say, stop this. And so it was, you know, really a confusing moment, because they said, okay, we followed all parliamentarian procedure. It was adopted, discussed by the parliament. And so that means it was a very democratic decision. So, but people said, okay, you did it in a way that we did not understand, but now we see the effects, and we want to have a say to rethink the decision. It was done already 10 years ago. And so, and finally, the outcome, it's not yet settled. But what then because then the local prime minister invited, you know, an elderly statesman, a minister who has joined now ATTAC network in Germany, Mr. Geisler, a former minister from the Christian Democratic Union, and now an ATTAC member, and he should be the moderator. And when he started the moderation just last week, he said, for the first time in the German policy procedures, we have now 3 parties on the table. That means we have the industry, we have the policy, and we have the citizens themselves. So he did not use the term multi-stakeholder, but it was, you know, to try to settle this conflict on a railway station is more or less directly or indirectly inspired by the experience on the internet, that you can settle problems only if the concerned and affected people who are really involved are also involved in then policy development and decision making. And I think insofar, I think the experiences which are made with the internet in governing critical resources of the internet, like domain names, IP addresses, and related issues, you know, will spill over to other arenas of the real life. And so far, this will be probably the most significant political effect. But as I said a little bit earlier, we are in the first decade of the 21st century. So this will take some time and will create a lot of fierce battles, because we are talking here about a power shift. And that means a redistribution of decision-making power. And the power shifts always lead to power struggle. That's very understandable, because some people have to give up some of their decision-making powers, have to share it with others. So, and sharing power, this is a very, very difficult process. In particular, if people spend half of their life to get decision-making power, and then they are the prime minister of a country and they have a 2/3 majority in the parliament, and then they want to use this and to push through. So I think this is the contrast program to the multi-stakeholder approach, which is bottom-up, open, transparent, inclusive. Insofar, we will see in the years ahead a lot of battle between these 2 policy models, the traditional top-down majority voting system, and the other one, rough consensus, bottom-up. And I expect there will be a lot of political controversies in the years ahead, both nationally and internationally.
Yeah, I was considering the participation of civil society, and in particular end user, because internet definitely changed the way we communicate. We don't communicate now that we put an effort in typing letters, we usually link or add a video, and but most of the regulation on copyright, not only piracy, but I'm thinking of fair use of copyright, is done without people, users actually, without civil society, without even creators apart from those that already built their big industries and that are actually big corporations, like for example Prince or other artists. Do you think that this shift might happen even in those cases that are clearly commercial issues?
My answer is yes. And the experience, why I think the yes is the right answer is, if you, I don't know whether you are familiar with the ACTA negotiations. So I think this was done in a really, a small number of governments, even, a small number of governments only, they exclude a lot of other governments. So we are sitting together how we can create such a system. And only after civil society, discovered this and made it public, and so the alarm bell was ringing, then, you saw that after all the pressure, they had to open it. So now the documents are more or less public available. This does not yet mean that the final decision is really influenced then by the civil society, but they changed already the environment for this. And if they continue with the draft as it stands with the ACTA negotiation, probably then this will have the same destiny like the German law on filtering the internet, that they adopt this ACTA treaty, but it doesn't work because they have created, the civil society has created now such a rumor that the European Parliament is dealing with that. And insofar, very often the role of the civil society is really to create public awareness, to, bring more publicity, openness, transparency to the processes, and then you have the self-steering mechanisms very often. That means if industry and government sitting together and have to be aware that the rest of the public is listening, then you know, this has a very interesting you know, effect, that then they behave much more carefully. And insofar, transparency is, as a democratic principle, becomes in this very complex world probably much more important than traditional representativeness, so that you elect every 4 years a representative, and then you trust him that he will do the right things, but you have no clue what he is doing. That means if you bring more transparency to the processes and also then more accountability, so this will probably enhance the let's say the democratic nature. So that means if we talk about participatory democracy, this does not mean to substitute the representative democracy. It's enhancing the representative democracy. So my argument is not a revolution, that we should forget about the system and establish a new system. It's because the system has a lot of, you know, very well elaborated elements, in particular if you live really in a democratic society, but it has also, you know, its limitations. And to enhance the system, the participatory element, the direct participation of civil society and policy development and decision-making processes is an enhancement, brings, you know, more sustainability to decisions. And that's why I say, you know, if you have only two stakeholders, governments and private sector, on the table, and not the users, then the user will be the loser, because, insofar, if you are interested, and governments more and more are obliged to think about sustainability of their decisions, because they need a stable country. Some governments ignore this very often and do not think about the stability of their country, but this will fire back sooner or later. But insofar, you know, there is no alternative than to be more inclusive. This does not mean very often, as I said, that you have a direct influence into final decision-making, but in the policy shaping in the environment can make a difference. And again, this is only the beginning of a new development, and nobody knows what will happen in the next 20 or 30 years. Remember, 15 years ago, there was no Google. 10 years ago, there was no Facebook and no YouTube. So what will be in 10 years from now? Nobody knows.
I think on that, we can conclude. Thank you so much once again.